So I finally reassembled my fixed chronometric speedometer, the one that I put the new bush into, and that bush made a huge difference. That little drive input gear is rock solid now. So that was definitely a problem with it. It took me about an hour and a half, maybe 2 hours to get this back together. They're just so fiddly, and there's springs everywhere and little bits that go flying off, and yeah, they're just a pain in the neck. So I don't really like doing them, but it's great to see this one working again. I did have to take it apart because I actually got this gear here the wrong way around, so it wasn't working. I had to disassemble it slightly and reassemble it to get it to work again. But this does work now if we put the face back on. The face is held with two little pins that go into there, sort of like that, and then when it's all in the housing it all gets held together. And I've got a couple of needles. They're getting a bit loose actually, so I may need a drop of glue or Loctite or something on one of them to keep it in place, and I do need to repaint them. But if we get that, it's not exactly set, but it should be enough to give the idea. And then we set this up. I need something to press it against to react the torque. That's the interesting thing about these gauges, and this is one of the reasons I've heard why they used chronometric tachometers. I don't know if this is true, but the thing with them is if you stop them immediately, it'll show you the last reading that it took. So, say we were going 30 miles an hour and hit a tree, the needle's stuck, the needle stops because the clockwork stops. You have to restart it again and it'll jump back. So this is what gives the gauges the very jerky needle, the fact that it's a mechanical mechanism flicking the needle back to zero. So you don't have to turn it very fast either for it to start reading, but if I just turn this slowly, you'll see it jump all the way back down. Yeah. So I'm going to call that a success. That one seems to work very nicely. Unfortunately, this gauge, I've got two housings here. They're slightly different years, and the one I need to use for this gauge is this one because it's got the little hole, which is for the mileometer reset. So I need to take this one apart and clean it up and put it back together as a nice gauge. So one thing I will do is use my little laser cutter to cut out a couple of new gaskets for it. I'll probably clean this up and repaint it. And one thing that helps with gauges like this is you can paint the inside of them white, and it helps reflect the light that comes in through the little sort of windows on the outside there. I want to be careful with these little plastic windows. I'll take those out before I clean up the outside casing, and the rest of it should clean up pretty nicely. And the rings are just sort of bayonet type fitting on the outside edge, so you can get these ones apart. That's one of the differences with the modern gauges. Maybe the modern real Smiths ones are still like this, but the cheap ones you get, the front bezel thing is always sort of rolled over, which means you can't easily get the gauges apart. They're not too hard to strip, but these ones are much nicer because you can get into them. So yeah, I think that one's come up really nicely. I do need to, I'm just going to repaint the needle white. The paint's actually come off it, so I'll just give that a really quick touch up, and I think that'll be done. And I've got a pile of spare parts from a dead one, so if I come across any more, I've got parts that I can use to rebuild them, including this housing. So you can see on this one, which hasn't been rebushed, oh, it's a bit hard, but there's a lot of in and out movement, but there is also a lot of it's really tricky to show it. Focus there. Oh yeah, there you go. You can see. So on this one, there's at least a 1/16 of an inch movement on the end of that. You can see it. So at least I know now that you can rebush these, which is quite cool. Like I say, I just bored it out to about 6mm on the mill. I was able to run an end mill down there and machine up a suitable little brass sort of bush for it, and that seems to be working, and I've got no reason to think that won't go on working for tens of thousands of miles. I did refill the little oil reservoir. I cleaned out the felt with some lighter fluid and re-oiled it. You don't want too much oil in there. If you leave it sitting up this way, any excess oil will drip out the bottom, so I'll just leave it sitting like that for a while, and there should just be enough in there to keep it going nicely for years. A couple of other quick things to note. I was going to airbrush the needle, but I didn't have enough paint for that. I just had a tiny amount in the bottom of the jar, so I just reduced it down a little bit with some isopropyl alcohol, and there was just enough there to brush onto the needle. You only need about a drop. The other thing worth noting is on the one that I repaired, to repair it you have to remove this drive gear, this little worm gear, and there's a small pin, a sort of rivet that goes through. You can just see it. So you have to remove that, and then you can pull this thing apart. I had to replace that, and the way I did that is I measured the hole. I used my little set of micro-sized drill bits and used those to figure out what diameter the hole was. It turned out to be 0.95 of a millimeter. And then I went through my box of random springs that I collect. Anytime I take something apart, I keep all the springs, and found a spring where the wire used in the spring was the correct diameter, and just cut off a short length of that and poke that through the hole. And again, that's fixed in place with a little bit of Loctite. So hopefully that's enough to be able to keep that intact. You can just see the pin through there. That should work, I hope. But I've also laser cut the new gasket. I have taken the housing apart. I'm going to clean off that up and repaint it and put that back together. One problem with these things is there's a rubber gasket. So this gasket goes in here and the glass sits on it. What I've done in the past with other gauges is replace that with an O-ring. And if you get the sizing right, it works just as well. I could try laser cutting something, I guess, maybe from very thin foam, but I don't think I've got any foam that thin that I could cut it from. So I'll see if I can get an O-ring, suitably sized O-ring. It's about 80 millimeters, I think. So it's looking quite good. I'm avoiding touching the face. The face I cleaned with just warm soapy water, and then I actually wiped it down with my electrical clean and lube. So it's a lubricant. It didn't affect the paint. I tested it very carefully before I tried that, and I just wiped that on because it effectively leaves a very thin film of oil, which should stop it rusting, I'm hoping. Been doing a few small car bits and pieces today. Painting the brackets, That's for the rear half of the car. I still have to do all the brackets for the front, of course. I'll leave those for a few days and then turn them over and paint the other side. And I've started making the headlamp brackets, and these I am making from 5mm thick steel. This end is the end that the lamp bolts to, and this other end is where it bolts to the bracket. So I'm just kind of rounding those ends off, and I might taper this a little bit. So I cut the pieces of steel and bolted them together, and I just use this piece of wood underneath them as a kind of carrier, so I can still lay it flat on the little bandsaw and on the sanding machine, so I can sand the edges. I've already broken my first bandsaw blade. I'm not even quite sure how. It wasn't even cutting anything very strenuous. I think maybe it just sort of got jammed up, and so I've snapped the first blade. But I will. It works well for cutting this sort of thing. Cutting the steel just makes it so easy. And I think that's about it. I have the pieces for the speedometer sitting in a vaporous, so they're all getting derusted. I'll clean them up, get all the paint off them, and just repaint them, tidy them up. And I still need to get the O-ring for the glass. So a few little bits and pieces. I'm out in my lab again, just finishing off the second chronometric meter I rebuilt. I've painted the housing. I just painted it black in the end. Fitted a new paper gasket in the bottom, and I've just been remaking the little clear windows, which are what lets light shine in onto the face of the dial. These use these little plastic strips, and I'm assuming they were clear originally, but they go brittle and they fade over time. So I've just remade them from a bit of plastic drink bottle, clear plastic. And the first thing I tried doing was actually laser cutting them. So the plastic is curved, of course, so I taped it down. And it's also hard to laser cut clear things sometimes. So a layer of tape over the top helps. And that kind of works. But the problem is with a laser, of course, is the heat. So it melts things. So in the end, I just made them by hand. And the only really tricky bit is these little notches in the ends. And the little notch is so that it fits up against that little notch there. That's what holds them in place. So it's easy enough to cut the strips just using a scalpel or a sharp knife, and then to make the little notches in the end I used my little electronic panel nibbler tool. This is just a there we go. It's just a little punch. You use this for punching holes in panels for electronics projects, and that let me just make the little notches in the end, and I was able to make the windows. So I believe they're really just there as sort of dust covers. So I'm going to reassemble this now. I don't have an O-ring for the front glass, but I should be able to reassemble it with the old rubber seal and see what it looks like. So this is the finished thing. It's got the little windows in there. Everything's back together. I've got the glass back on. I think I've got most of the fingerprints off it and off the face. It's cleaned up really well. And when these are working well, you can actually spin them over by hand and see them working. A bit easier with two hands, but it's a bit hard to hold it with one hand and spin it at the same time. But if you use both hands, you can actually spin them by hand and see them working. So I think that one's nice. The only thing you have to be careful about on these ones with the trip meter is when you assemble it with the little trip reset. I'm going to have to make a little piece that fits on there. Just a little extension tube with the knob on the end, so you pull that and you turn it, and that's what resets the trip. But yeah, that one's come out really well. So now I have two working chronometric speedometers, neither of which are probably correct, but we'll see.